When you open the pages of the ancient texts to the very beginning, you are met with a cosmic spectacle of unimaginable scale. Galaxies are spun into existence, oceans are poured into their basins, and the intricate balance of life on Earth is established with a mere spoken word. The sheer magnitude of the universe, billions of stars, endless nebulas, the complex dance of planetary physics, is summarized in just 2 short chapters in the book of Genesis. The Creator speaks, and it is so. It is a sweeping, majestic narrative that moves with the rapid pace of infinite power. Yet, as you keep reading and arrive at the book of Exodus, you encounter a paradox that has baffled scholars and everyday readers alike. The narrative abruptly slows to a painstaking, almost excruciating crawl. Why is it that the creation of the entire cosmos requires only 2 chapters, while the construction of a portable goat hair tent in the middle of a barren desert consumes 13 long, exhausting chapters? For a long time, I must confess, I found these chapters incredibly tedious. Reading through endless lists of cubits, loop counts, bronze clasps, and specific types of wood felt like reading an ancient instruction manual for assembling flat-pack furniture. It felt dry, repetitive, and entirely disconnected from the grand spiritual themes I was searching for. But as I took a step back and began to look at the historical and psychological landscape of the people involved, the dry lists transformed. I began to see that this wasn't just an architectural blueprint. It was a deeply intimate love letter written in the language of dimensions and fabrics. It was a profound psychological intervention for a broken people. To truly understand the Tabernacle, we have to stand where the Israelites stood. Imagine a people who have known nothing but brutal slavery for 400 years, 4 centuries of the crack of the whip, of forced labor under the scorching Egyptian sun, of their identities being reduced to mere brick-making machines. The only concept of the divine they had ever been exposed to was the Egyptian pantheon. Distant, terrifying, and demanding gods who resided in colossal, immovable pyramids of stone built upon the blood and crushed bones of slaves. The gods of Egypt were unapproachable tyrants. When the Israelites were miraculously led out of Egypt and found themselves at the foot of Mount Sinai, they were physically free, but psychologically, they were still slaves. They were traumatized, fearful, and inherently suspicious of authority. If the God who rescued them simply declared his majesty from the top of a thundering, smoking mountain, he would remain terrifying and distant. If he commanded them to build a massive stone ziggurat or pyramid, he would be no different from the pharaohs they had just escaped. Instead, he did something radically different. He asked them to build a tent, a fragile, movable structure that could be packed up and carried on their shoulders. He wasn't asking them to climb up to the heavens to find him. He was announcing his intention to pack his bags and move down into the dirt and dust of the wilderness to live among them. The 13 chapters detail exactly how this infinitely vast creator was willing to compress his glory into a finite space, simply because he wanted to be close to a traumatized, wandering people. It wasn't about the tent itself. It was about the profound, unprecedented desire for proximity. When we look closer at the design of this desert dwelling, a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. The tabernacle was not an entirely new concept drawn out of thin air. Rather, it was a deliberate, meticulous echo of something ancient. It was, in many ways, Eden 2.0. If we read the text horizontally, laying the blueprints of the tabernacle over the story of the Garden of Eden, the parallels are striking and deeply intentional. In the beginning, Eden was not just a lush garden. It was the original sanctuary. It was the place where heaven and earth perfectly overlapped, where the Creator and humanity walked side by side in the cool of the day, without barriers, without fear, and without shame. But as the story goes, that intimate connection was fractured. Humanity's rebellion introduced a tear in the fabric of reality. Humanity was exiled, sent eastward out of the garden, and cherubim, fearsome angelic beings, were stationed at the entrance with a flaming sword to guard the way back to the tree of life. The tragedy of the human condition, from that moment on, has been defined by a deep, aching homesickness for a place we have never physically been, but that our souls remember. There has been a lingering, silent void. The tabernacle is the breathtaking announcement that God is actively working to bridge that void. Every detail of the tent was designed to evoke the lost sanctuary of Eden. Just as humanity was exiled to the east, the sole entrance to the tabernacle faced east. To enter the tent was to symbolically walk back westward, back toward the presence of the Creator. As one moved deeper into the sanctuary, the imagery became overwhelmingly garden-like. The inner curtains and the heavy veil guarding the deepest room were masterfully embroidered with figures of cherubim, a stark reminder of the angelic guards at Eden's gate. Only this time, the cherubim were not there to keep people out. They were woven into the fabric of a space designed to welcome humanity back in. Perhaps the most beautiful connection was the menorah, the golden lampstand that provided the only light in the holy place. This was no ordinary candelabra. The blueprints explicitly commanded that it be shaped like a tree, complete with branches, buds, and blossoms of almonds. It was a stylized, glowing replica of the tree of life, burning brightly in the dark confines of the tent. I often think about what it must have felt like for a priest to step into that room out of the blinding, harsh desert sun, to be surrounded by the smell of sweet incense, the soft golden light flickering off the golden walls, illuminating the woven angels and the golden tree. It was a microcosmos, a tiny pocket of restored creation floating in a sea of wilderness. The tabernacle was God's way of saying that the garden was not lost forever. He was planting a new Eden right in the middle of their barren reality, proving that his ultimate goal has always been, and will always be, to dwell with his creation. There is a glaring logistical question that arises when reading the inventory of the tabernacle. Where on earth did a tribe of wandering ex-slaves get tons of gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, and exotic animal skins while stranded in a desolate wasteland? The answer lies in the dramatic events of their exodus. As they left Egypt, the text records that they plundered the Egyptians. Their former captors, eager to see them leave after a series of devastating plagues, thrust their wealth upon them. This means that the materials used to build the most sacred space on earth were, in fact, the spoils of an oppressive empire. They were the back wages of 400 years of slavery, stained with the sweat and tears of generations. There is something profoundly redemptive about this detail. The Creator did not conjure raw, unblemished materials out of thin air to build his dwelling place. He chose to take the physical reminders of their trauma, the wealth of their oppressors, and melt it down to create something holy. He was teaching them that their painful history was not something to be discarded or hidden, but something that could be transformed. The gold that might have once fashioned a shackle or an idol was repurposed to form the mercy seat. Equally fascinating is the workforce chosen for this monumental task. When we think of the great heroes of ancient scriptures, we usually think of prophets calling down fire, kings leading armies, or patriarchs hearing voices from the heavens. But when the time came to build the tabernacle, God singled out a man named Bezalel, and his assistant Oholiab. The text notes something extraordinary about Bezalel. He is the very first person in the entire biblical narrative to be described as being filled with the Spirit of God. And for what purpose? Not to preach, not to part a sea, but to be an artisan. He was filled with the Spirit to have skill, ability, and knowledge in all kinds of crafts, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, and to carve wood. This detail has completely reshaped how I view human creativity. We often draw an arbitrary line between the sacred work of spiritual teaching and the secular work of the hands. But the construction of the tabernacle obliterates this divide. The very first manifestation of divine inspiration resting upon a human being was for the purpose of making art. God is the ultimate creator, the master artist of the cosmos, and when he wanted to build a home on earth, he partnered with human artists. He valued the painstaking labor of weaving threads, the precise strike of a hammer on hot metal, and the careful sanding of acacia wood. The beauty of the tabernacle was not a frivolous luxury, it was a theological necessity. Beauty is the language of the divine, and through Bezalel and the unnamed men and women who spun yarn and cast bronze, we learn that our creative labor, no matter how mundane it may seem, can be a holy collaboration to build places of refuge and light in a dark world. To understand the tabernacle is to take a journey. It was not a building you simply walked into casually. Its architecture was deliberately designed to facilitate a psychological and spiritual progression from the harsh exterior of human brokenness into the warm, intimate center of divine perfection. It was an inward journey of purification. As an Israelite approached the tabernacle, the first thing they encountered in the outer courtyard was not a welcoming hearth, but the bronze altar of burnt offering. This was a place of smoke, heat, and blood. It was visceral and confronting. In our modern sensibilities, we often shy away from the ancient rituals of sacrifice, finding them gruesome or primitive. But in a world where the reality of human evil, selfishness, and the breaking of relational bonds was an everyday occurrence, the altar served a vital psychological function. It was a visual, tangible representation of the cost of restoration. You cannot simply sweep wrongdoing under the rug. Justice requires that debt be acknowledged. The altar was where the heavy burden of guilt and shame was transferred and consumed. It was the necessary first step. You cannot enter into intimacy with the divine while holding on to the destructive baggage of your failures. Just past the altar stood the bronze basin. This is where the priests would wash their hands and feet before proceeding further. The fascinating detail about this basin is that it was cast from the bronze mirrors donated by the women who served at the entrance. In the ancient world, mirrors were highly polished pieces of metal, items of personal vanity and outward reflection. By melting these mirrors down into a basin of cleansing water, the symbolism shifted from outward vanity to inward reflection. Before stepping into the holy place, one had to look at their true self, acknowledge their impurities, and wash them away. Stepping through the first veil into the holy place, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The noise, the heat, and the smell of the courtyard faded, replaced by quiet reverence. Here, illuminated by the golden tree-like menorah, stood the table of showbread. On it lay 12 loaves of bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. This was a profound statement of relationship. In ancient Near Eastern culture, sharing a meal was the ultimate sign of peace, covenant, and friendship. The bread symbolized that God was the provider, yes, but also that he desired fellowship. He wanted to sit at the table with humanity. Nearby stood the altar of incense, where sweet-smelling smoke rose continuously. This represented the prayers of the people, suggesting that human voices and longings were an essential, fragrant part of the atmosphere of heaven. Finally, hidden behind a thick, heavy veil, was the Holy of Holies. It was a perfect cube of absolute darkness, save for the blazing presence of God. Inside rested only one object, the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-plated wooden chest holding the stone tablets of the law. Covering the Ark was the mercy seat, flanked by golden cherubim. This room represented the ultimate tension. The law inside the Ark exposed humanity's constant failure, demanding justice. But the blood sprinkled on the mercy seat, covering the law, represented grace. Here, in the deepest, most hidden room of the tent, absolute justice and boundless mercy met and embraced. It was the heartbeat of the entire structure, the epicenter where the infinite Creator condensed His glory just enough to meet with a fragile human being without destroying them. It was a terrifying, yet breathtakingly beautiful reality. As deeply significant as the tabernacle in the wilderness was, looking at the broader horizontal sweep of history reveals that it was never meant to be a permanent fixture. It was a shadow, a prototype pointing toward a much grander, unfolding reality. The evolution of God's dwelling place is one of the most compelling narrative arcs in the entire human story, moving from a nomadic tent to something entirely unexpected. After the Israelites settled in the Promised Land, the portable goat hair tent eventually gave way to the magnificent stone temple built by King Solomon in Jerusalem. The architecture expanded, the gold was multiplied, and the rituals became institutionalized. Yet, despite its grandeur, the core issue remained. There was still a thick veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of humanity. The presence of God was localized, restricted to a specific geographic coordinate, and accessible only by a single high priest once a year. The distance, though bridged, still existed. The radical shift occurred centuries later in the opening pages of the New Testament. The writer John drops a theological bombshell when he introduces Jesus of Nazareth. He writes, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." In the original Greek text, the phrase "made his dwelling" literally translates to tabernacled. John was telling his readers that this human being, walking the dusty roads of Galilee, was the ultimate fulfillment of those 13 chapters in Exodus. The infinite Creator was no longer confining his presence to a tent of skins or a temple of stone. He had confined himself to a human body. Jesus became the walking, breathing tabernacle. In him, the perfect overlap of heaven and earth, the true Eden, was walking among fishermen, tax collectors, and outcasts. He was the bread of presence, the light of the menorah, and the ultimate meeting place between God and humanity. This trajectory reached its violent, world-altering climax on a Friday afternoon outside the city walls of Jerusalem. When Jesus was crucified, the Gospel accounts record a very specific detail. At the moment of his death, the massive, heavy veil in the Jerusalem temple, the descendant of the very veil woven by Bezalel to keep humanity out of the Holy of Holies, was torn completely in two, from top to bottom. It was an unmistakable declaration from the heavens. The barriers were gone. The localized presence of God had broken out of its confines. This leads to the final, most staggering evolution of the dwelling place. Following the resurrection and the events of Pentecost, the narrative shifts again. The sacred space is no longer a tent, a building, or even a single localized human body. The writers of the early church began to address ordinary people, merchants, slaves, Romans, and Greeks, with a shocking new title. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit? This is where the 13 chapters of Exodus suddenly become incredibly personal. As I reflect on this journey, the blueprint makes sense. The detailed, meticulous care God took in designing a holy space was just a preamble. The ultimate goal was never to inhabit a building. The ultimate goal was to inhabit us. The human heart, with all its chaotic wilderness, its deep trauma, and its profound brokenness, is the very place the Creator desires to dwell. The tearing of the veil meant that the presence of God moved out of the architecture of human hands and took up residence within the architecture of the human soul. So we return to the grand paradox that started this entire exploration. Why did the author of the universe spend 2 brief chapters speaking galaxies into the void, but dedicate 13 agonizingly detailed chapters to the construction of a desert tent? The answer lies in the fundamental difference between building a house and healing a home. Speaking physical matter into existence, igniting stars, spinning planets, establishing the laws of gravity and thermodynamics, requires only the raw, uncontested exertion of infinite power. For an omnipotent God, creating a universe is effortless. It is a one-sided act of brilliance. But dealing with the human heart is a completely different endeavor. Humanity is not an inanimate collection of atoms. We are beings endowed with free will, carrying the deep scars of our own rebellions and the generational traumas of our history. You cannot simply bully a traumatized heart into trusting you. You cannot forcefully legislate intimacy. When God looked down at the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai, a people broken by slavery, terrified of authority, and prone to wander, he knew that mere power would only frighten them further. To bridge the gap between absolute holiness and profound human brokenness required a plan of meticulous, painstaking care. It required a physical process they could participate in. It required the melting down of their past, the washing of their hands, the smell of the bread, and the beauty of the gold. The 13 chapters are long because love is in the details. The tabernacle was God's way of saying, I know you are broken, I know you are in a wasteland, but I am going to step into the dust with you. We are going to build a space where we can meet, and I will be patient as you learn to trust me again. The story of the tabernacle is, ultimately, the story of the lengths to which the divine will go to recover what was lost in Eden. It is the undeniable proof that we are not abandoned in the wilderness. The creator of the cosmos is not standing afar off, demanding we build a tower to reach him. Instead, he has always been the one making the descent. He came down to a tent in the desert. He came down in the flesh to walk the streets of Jerusalem. And today, he crosses the ultimate threshold, desiring to take up residence in the quiet, hidden spaces of our own lives. The architecture of the ancient tent may have faded into the sands of time, but the relentless, pursuing love it represented is still the most powerful force in the universe, working tirelessly to turn the wilderness of our hearts into a place to call home.